Hello, and welcome to our next panel, the future of AML and fraud case management. My name is Manesh Samtani. I am the editor for Regulation Asia. So we often hear about how transaction monitoring systems can be further enhanced with data and technology, such as AI and machine learning. We covered that in our first panel of today. We're now here to talk about what happens once, for example, a transaction is flagged for further due diligence and investigation, and how case management systems can be enhanced to achieve better, faster outcomes to intercept true financial crime. Now, joining us on our panel of experts, we have first Mark Nuttall, Singapore country manager at Hill & Associates. Now, Mark was a former detective at New Scotland Yard, and he also spent several years at Interpol in specialized intelligence and investigations roles. In his current role at Hill & Associates, he oversees Singapore operations with a focus on risk management, risk assessment, fraud prevention, cybersecurity. Welcome, Mark.
Good morning. Good morning, Manesh. Pleased to be here, sir.
You're looking very spiffy today, Mark.
You know, I was always taught to get dressed up, to come to events nice and clean and tidy. I even had my wife nagging at me because I put a little bit of aftershave on today as well. I've got nobody to share this scent with, unfortunately, but it's a pleasure to be here.
I think you're the first one wearing a tie for this event.
No, there was one earlier on. I was watching.
Next, we have Rashmi Dubier, Managing Director and APAC Head of AML at MUFG Bank. Rashmi is a seasoned AML professional and practitioner, over 15 years experience building and managing complex AML compliance programs at large global banks, including Citibank, JP Morgan Chase. Welcome, Rashmi.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. We also have Robin Lee, Vice President for APAC at Napier. Robin began his career in Silicon Valley compliance startups, and then he worked among Wall Street hedge funds. Later in Singapore, he set up and then later sold his own compliance startup before joining Refinitiv, where his focus was on market development, risk, RegTech, and data. Now he's at Napier, and always a pleasure to have you join us, Robin.
Thank you, Manesh, and thank you, Regulation Asia, for having me, and thank you, everyone on the line, for attending. Really looking forward to this.
Thank you so much, Robin. And finally, we have Karyn Kenny. I believe she's trying to connect at the moment, but from the U.S. Department of Justice, the resident legal advisor for the U.S. Embassy in Malaysia at the moment. So Karyn previously served in a similar role in Bangladesh, and before that, she was an attorney advisor for the DOJ on money laundering, specializing in dismantling the financial networks of Mexican drug cartels. So hopefully she'll have some stories to share with us as well. We'll wait for her to connect. A very impressive panel. Thank you all for being with us today. Yeah. So before we kick off, just want to remind the audience to feel free to submit any questions throughout the discussion. We will try to get to them, and if we can, feel free to, again, send us an email, drop us a chat message, and so on. So I thought I might ask Mark to help us kick off the discussion. Just so we're here to talk about case management systems and investigations and so on. I thought maybe, Mark, you could outline some of the regulatory expectations there are currently for how financial institutions are meant to be handling case management and investigation, generated through other alerting systems. Go ahead, Mark.
I'd be delighted to take that honour. As Manesh set out a moment ago, I started my kind of proper career in the police service. I was always taught to get my pen out. That was the first thing that I learned how to do, is to write, and write very well, and to make sure that there's no errors in it, because it might go to court one day. And this overarches what I've been involved in these past 2 days, or these two half a days, with watching some of the panels that have gone on. And I've asked a repeated question in have you got an eye to the other law? Are you not just watching the regulators and what the regulators want, but actually what the government wants, what the international community wants, and what you're liable for? Are you going to be liable for a prison sentence if you do an illegal act, or you utilize systems, or you utilize platforms that aren't licensed for or aren't correct? Essentially, with RegTech, who's policing the police? which is what RegTech is trying to do at the moment. Case management, for me, is one of the most important things. When Manesh asked me to do this panel, he said, oh, it might not be the sexiest panel in the world, Mark. For me, it's the sexiest panel, because without case management, you've got nothing. You've just got a click a button and send to the law enforcement agency, the financial investigation agency in your jurisdiction. That's all you've got. If you've got no case management, you can't build an investigation, you can't understand the legal repercussions, you're never going to be able to understand the bigger picture that we've all been talking about over the past 2 days. It's complex and it requires detail. So I come from the UK. Everybody loves a British accent. We were talking about that before. Mine's not too British, it's more Northern England. So, you know, you get a bit of common in there for those that know the north of England. So with case management, you've got highly complex legislation for criminal procedure. And guess what? You've got it for civil procedure as well. So in the UK, you've got the civil procedure rules and you've got the criminal procedure rules, which govern everything that is going to one day end up in court, which might be anything. So I'm a really, really detailed person. And when it comes down to regulation technology or financial technology or any technology for that matter, case management is key, and case management should be within the overarching portfolio of the technology that you're going to take on. I know that Robin's going to speak about that in a moment, because obviously he's a vendor, he's a provider. I've seen his utility. It's excellent, as are a lot of others, but I truly believe that the devil is in the detail. I'm sure that when Karyn gets on, that she'll reaffirm that.
So yeah, Karyn will be on in a minute, I hope. I wonder maybe if we could ask Rashmi, you know, seeing as you work at a bank, I wonder if you could sort of describe the case management process. What are you typically looking for in case management? And I don't know if you can speak about certain areas that you think could be enhanced to sort of boost the efficiency of how the case management process is handled.
15 years back, I was part of the team that set up the first AML operations shop in APAC. So this was before we had AML regulations in most countries, before MAS 626 or the HKMA guidelines. And I still remember we sort of did a roadshow for regulators to go out and explain to them what it is that we were planning to do and why. And most of them looked confused. Said, this is, you want to know if a transaction is normal? Why don't you just ask the RM? What is an operations center going to do, right? So we've come a long way from there. And if you look at most banks now, pretty much everybody has an AML operations center. And that's because with every investigation, every AML investigation, part of the case management process, there is a very distinct operations layer. This is where you have the volumes. Everything gets thrown into, anything that needs a second look gets thrown into this big bucket, from your transaction monitoring systems, from your operation shop. So if staff identify red flags, your first line staff, everything gets thrown into this big bucket that somebody has to sit and sort through. So that within that operations layer, there's definitely a lot of room for efficiency, and you could have efficiency by way of automating some of the due diligence steps, because at that layer, it's low skilled volume work, which is highly procedural. So there's a lot of room for automation there. And there's also room for technologies like AI, where you can identify alerts or cases that are obviously going to be unproductive and just come in and auto close. So there is a lot of room for efficiency in that layer. We can't entirely do away with that layer, because you need that to meet your regulatory requirements, your expectations. You need to tick the box with the regulator. So everything does have to be that needs escalation should be escalated, and it needs to go through your formal case management process. And then there is your actual investigations layer, and this is where a lot of subject matter expertise comes in, and it's very bespoke. Every case is different, and the due diligence that you need to do, the level of reviews that you need to do, whether you're going to commission an external search, are you going to use IMB checks, are you going to do vessel checks? It requires a lot of judgment-based decisioning based on the facts of the case and ability to connect dots. So that's where you need that human intelligence. there is room for efficiency there again in seeing, how best you can get all the required data in front of your investigator. And subsequently, when you do your self-filing, your SDR filings, how do you autofill the forms? This is the reams of paperwork that goes with every SDR that you file. And there's room for efficiency there if you could bring in technology to help complete some of the work for the investigator.
Thank you, Rashmi. That's really interesting. Maybe I could sort of look to Robin for kind of the different perspectives. I know you're working with a lot of financial institutions, maybe not just on case management, but if we could focus on that for now. I know it's just one aspect of what you do. But in terms of the case management systems that you've sort of gone in and seen at different banks, what are some of the main challenges that they're really talking about, and what are the areas that are in need of improvement the most?
From what I'm seeing in the market, the challenge with existing case management systems is that they're either task specific, if you want to call it, that's assigned to a particular task. So whether it's a KYC case management system versus a transaction monitoring case management system, and that's all they do. So that's number one. And then number two is the fact that when you get these different products and you're trying to integrate them together. So if you take like transaction monitoring, for example, right? You have one vendor that makes the transaction monitoring system. You have another vendor that makes the risk-based scorecard system. You have another vendor that makes the case management system. And so getting these things to talk to each other, you've got to get systems integrators in and guys like that to really try and align everything. But the most important part is getting the data to align as well, which is even tougher still.
Thanks, Robin. I see we have Karyn here who's joining. Thank you, Karyn. So I guess one of the questions we were talking about earlier was some of the regulatory expectations for case management systems. I know as a federal prosecutor, you've worked with law enforcement, you've dealt with a lot of cases, so you're quite familiar with this process. I just wondered if maybe you had any thoughts on the current case management process and how it can be improved.
The communication process?
Case management process.
Case management. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Manesh, and my apologies to everyone for the delay. I appreciate you and Simon for getting me online. The case management, what I wanted to just share with everyone is that from the end user, if you will, in a case in a prosecution, we rely very heavily on the skill set and the data that is gathered at the very beginning, if you will, the boots to the ground stage, which is wherein I believe a lot of your colleagues and people watching today are. And as a federal prosecutor, what we're doing ultimately, if you will, like a director, I'm taking all the pieces together, analyzing them, looking through, applying them to the statutes. So when I look at case management, for me, that case management is going to begin at the very first start, which is the collection of data. Who's doing it? What are the protocols? And then what is that information? The next link in the chain, and a very important link, is the investigator. Whether for me it's DEA, HSI, FBI, what is their information? How are they working closely with the analytics? And then they will come, and oftentimes they will have a specialized financial analyst who will take all that data, knows what they're looking at, crunch it, and then give it to me. And then my job is to bring it all together and also to explain to the jury the processes. How did we come to this information? How did it start? What is the legitimacy or the provenance, if you will, of that information? So for me, case management is a million moving parts, bringing them all together.
I think Mark might agree with you on that. Mark, we've had a few discussions about the different pieces that you believe should be automatically incorporated into a case management. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, for us today, obviously, there's two of us that hail from a law enforcement kind of background. Both myself and Karyn bring the sexy element today to this conference, and then Robin and Rashmi bring the other sexy element. So we come from the truly sexy background, but the other two are far too beautiful to mention. So for me, as I stated earlier, the devil's in the detail. Karyn comes from a prosecution-based approach, law enforcement background. Okay, I come from a law enforcement specified background. So for me, within the UK, I put the case together, I decide what goes where, how, when, and then I go to my prosecutor for an impartial decision. It's got a bigger holistic remit. I took that knowledge and I went and did a delegated nominated officer's role within a bank. And within that bank, I noticed that, like the prosecution element within the US, there's a little bit here, 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 and then this person puts it all together up here. Is that really the best format? I'd say in certain jurisdictions it is, but with banking, where you've got significant organised crime players on a global basis, it's not perhaps the right model to go with. So I noticed that the fraud was over here, kind of AML was over here, the sanctions were, there was bits everywhere. And so production order and judges' orders were significantly over here as well. Never inputted into a system. There's some reasons for that, certainly within the UK and some other jurisdictions. However, you're missing a massive piece of the puzzle over here through not activating and viewing your case management systems. Then you've got all the complexities of outside data as well. And with case management, it's about a slow progression of putting that jigsaw together, as Karyn rightly spoke about a moment ago. As I said at the start of this, the pen. I started with a pen. I was told by my instructor within the police, write things down, learn them. Don't just go in head first. And that's the same with fintech, RegTech, the financial industry. Learn at the bottom and start your way up, because case management is complex. You need to understand the other legislation that sits in the background that will one day impact the financial institution that you're working for. If you want to look at it this way, enterprise risk management perspective. So you need to know how your actions are going to affect future events within that financial institution, if you're working within a financial institution. Because there's lots of matters when it comes down to case management. Because you've got law enforcement, you've got financial industry, you've got corporate clients, you've got legal clients, you've got global entities, you've got national entities, you've got regional entities, and it gets complex and complex and more complex. But you need to start with the bottom level of detail and information and being able to piece it together. If I learned one thing from Nuttall, it's that and it might seem very obvious, but every country works in a wholly different way, no matter where their jurisdictional legislation is originated from. So around here, Singapore, Malaysia, a couple of other countries, the UK brought across in its infinite wisdom the legislation that it deemed fit to bring within that cultural archetype. That has then impacted the region, but not the culture. Okay, so you've got different methods of case management throughout these jurisdictions. So from what Karyn might deal with over in Malaysia is different to what we deal with in Singapore, Hong Kong, especially now with the recent security legislation. And that security legislation will impact upon the fintech, RegTech infrastructure, because you'll have things moving on a vast basis. So today you've got the sanctioning of the individuals from the ICC. Yeah, how massively is that going to impact the global sphere and the international organisations, and then the banks, and then the fintech RegTech industry?
Yeah, that's really interesting. You talked about
before I carry on.
All the different points of data, I suppose, that you ideally want to feed into your case management system. Maybe Robin, you can talk a bit about that, being our resident technologist. How do you get all this sort of data from whether it's a transaction monitoring system, whether it's from biometrics, whether it's from payment screening and so on? How does all this data, in your perspective, how does it feed into the case management system? How should it? And I guess, where do you get efficiencies out of that?
By the way, resident technology, is that another way of saying Silicon Valley nerd?
Yeah.
But yeah.
I was being polite.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, to answer your question, I mean, I can certainly talk about it from a Napier perspective and how we do things at Napier. We've kind of put together a platform, and this platform isn't just a software platform like an iOS or Android or something like that, but it's also a data platform as well. And so based on this platform approach that we take, we build the different apps on top of that, which include transaction monitoring, risk-based scorecard, a case management tool, the payment screening that you mentioned, as well as a client screening piece as well. And so what happens, excuse me, is this data platform not only takes in data from the different apps themselves, but we can also integrate it with other elements, other systems which and ingest the data from them, so whether it be a core banking system or a CRM or what have you. And so, you know, the nerd term is what we build, what's called a data lake within that platform. And then from that, everything can get extracted. And that's kind of what I was insinuating earlier on the previous question, that because we have this data lake within our platform, our case management system can ingest pretty much anything, whether it be the transaction monitoring data, right through to the payment screening data, right through to the KYC data, external systems as well. We use a technology called Apache NiFi, which is basically a really easy way of ingesting data into our solution, compatible with all data ingestion types that are around today, and then build the apps based on this.
So that data, once it's sort of, let's say, in the case management system, is that something that then a user would have to go through manually and sort of sift through, or can some of those processes be automated?
The process will be automated. So we offer workflows as well, which are configurable. Not they don't require coding, right? The configuration. So it's just a matter of you know, ticking a couple of boxes or opening a couple of fields and mapping that data to that specific field, and we can put that together very, very quickly here at Napier.
Okay, so sounds like that kind of.
One other thing, Manesh, is one thing that we're seeing is, from a case management perspective, is not just to look at things from that transaction monitoring perspective or that KYC perspective, but from the full-blown customer perspective. And when me and Mark were talking about this earlier, he actually got really, really excited about this element, because he thinks it could be very, very useful for anyone who has to do this stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've seen Mark get excited. I thought maybe Rashmi, we could ask Rashmi, you know, because you're at a bank, and, you know, I assume there's, you know, when cases come in there, I understand there's still a lot of manual work involved, as we were talking about earlier. What do you sort of see, I suppose, you know, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years down the track? Do you see case management at a bank sort of working the same way, or how do you envision sort of these systems being enhanced? How would you like them enhanced to make your life and your job easier?
Work that people like Robin are doing can see that it's already changing. As a compliance officer in a bank, you have two sets of responsibilities. There's the responsibility to protect the bank from regulatory risks, which means you have to achieve technical compliance with regulations every single time. And then there's the social responsibility and the need to protect the bank from reputational risk, which is where you actually need the ability to identify true financial crimes risks and help mitigate those risks. Now, for the regulatory risk, where you have to achieve technical compliance, you don't have a choice. You do have to tick all the boxes, which means you need to cast a wide net and catch everything that could potentially match any of the regulatory red flags. So that I don't see that going away in the near future, and unless, you know, regulators completely decide to change their approach to how they're going to supervise banks, that's not going to change. So banks will still have to go through that voluminous process, the operational process that I talked about earlier. But case management systems can help speed up that process. But then comes the actual financial crimes risk mitigation layer, where you could take, and it's actually more effective to take a targeted approach centered on specific risks, specific typologies, and having a data lake with, oh wow, what's that?
You look like Thor.
I
just want to say that.
Work out at the same time as, anyway, sorry.
So that's where having a data lake with your case management system could prove to be a game changer, because that gives you the ability to connect dots across identified red flags. You're not just looking at potentially suspicious transactions and exceptions that are generated from your transaction monitoring systems, but you're looking at cases that previously resulted in a SAR, and having a data lake gives you the ability to see if any of the parties involved in that case are associated with any of your other customers. Do those same names or entities appear in KYC files? If the same case management system applies to your screening process as well, has your screening process picked up anything that's relevant? So you then have this analytics layer sitting on top with a really good case management tool that helps you focus on specific risks which are likely to be highly productive. So your transaction monitoring systems typically have very, very low productivity, less than 0.1% in most cases. But when you have the ability to then target your reviews on specific risks through a really good case management system, your productivity rate, your conversion rate is going to be quite high.
And I think I was wanting to ask a bit about that second layer, right? The sort of investigations layer. How do you sort of, and I guess we should differentiate, so we're talking about internal investigations within a bank versus the sort of law enforcement side, which we'll get to in a minute. But I wonder if you could speak to some of the ways that banks can sort of improve efficiency in the investigations work itself as well.
The endpoint is very different, right? For a bank, the endpoint is a file, no file decision.
Yeah.
You don't have to be able to prove anything. So as long as you have a reasonable basis for suspicion, you go ahead and file, you're done. And any subsequent work that is done is for internal risk mitigation. Depending on the degree of suspicion and our own risk appetite, you then decide whether that's a customer that you want to continue to bank, or do you want to take any further actions to mitigate. But the file, no file decision, that just requires a reasonable basis for suspicion. So how far do you go with that? It's in most instances, the investigations are based on Google searches, research tools that are readily available to investigators. We're not going to be spending days, weeks. Timing is also critical. We can't be sitting on a reportable transaction for too long, right? So we need to file, and at the most, you have 2 to 3 weeks to make a decision. To the extent possible, it's going to be based on tools that are readily accessible to investigators. Again, the more tools the investigators have access to at their desktop, the more efficient that process is going to be. But there may be exceptional circumstances where it could be either a highly complex case where it takes you time to connect all the dots, and the information you need for your research is not readily available. You need to commission external searches. Those investigations typically have a long tail, or where we are dealing with sensitive customer, a government entity or someone with a governmental connection, for example, where you want to be a bit careful and you want to make sure that you've dotted all your I's and crossed all your T's. Those investigations will have a long tail, and with those cases, it is what it is. You have to go through that process. There are no shortcuts.
So I guess we can also once you get to that decision that it's a reportable transaction, it gets reported. Mark, can you talk a bit about the process that comes after that?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, it shouldn't be the Mark Nuttall show here, so Karyn can always pipe up at some point as well. I've worked in both levels. So let's give the UK, for example. So UK, it'll fly over to the National Crime Agency, it will sit in a pile. If it's a consent SAR, it will go to, straight away, it will go to constabulary. So it might go to Metropolitan Court, it might go to Northumbria. Okay, so it depends on where that individual might live or that transaction has occurred. If it's a normal SAR, of which there are millions, it will sit in a pile, be ready to digest by law enforcement at some point in the future. That was the UK's model. Whether it is anymore, I don't know. I'm not involved with law enforcement. I haven't been since 2016. So this is the problem: is that there is too much data, which is where robbing comes in, or which is where one of the many other. I should look like a race car driver by now with all the advertisements on me, sat around with my lapels on. So, but one of those products is made to do that process. As one of your panel presenters stated earlier, and I think you were hosting the panel, talking about rubbish data. There's never any rubbish data, but I understand what he was talking about. Because if law enforcement, who are very, very busy creatures, get 1 million SARs, they're never going to be able to deal with it because the technology is archaic. So at a law enforcement end, there's always this discussion in relation to public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships will never really get off the ground unless, and I spoke about this on one of your other panels with another competitor, another badge on my shoulder, that actually what you have is you've got no legal body in there, you've got nobody to watch the detail, and you have very little in terms of understanding technology and how the material will be converted with all the Data Protection Act legislation, Civil Procedure Act, Criminal Procedure Act, etc., etc. So investigation at the other end, once the STR has gone through, does depend whether it's a consent process or not. Different processes in different countries as well. There might not be a consent process in one country. And this is kind of the problem, is that we have standards that are recommendations. So FATF recommends. Yeah? So you don't get the same in every single country because it depends on whether or not that specific law or architecture can cope with a different cultural bias that has been made in another country, because that's what it's all about.
And I guess, Karyn, you're one step further along in that process. As a prosecutor, what are you looking for in sort of a case that lands on your desk once it's been through all these, earlier processes we've been talking about?
Sure, thank you. And I think I'd like to back up a little bit and just talk a little bit about how cases would wind up on my desk as a federal prosecutor. And to open a U.S. federal case is, there's actually an expression used in America, don't make it a federal case, because it becomes this huge, very complex, but a very detailed prosecution. So when we undertake any prosecution, regardless of the stage that it is at, Manesh, we do it very carefully. We take our time. We make sure that we have the evidence, and that evidence is evidence that is transparent. And bottom line for me, the one thing I care about, Manesh, I care about, can I get it into evidence in a courtroom in the United States? Because if I can't get it into evidence in a courtroom, I might as well hang it on my wall and admire it, because it's useless to me. And that's not just the data, the numbers, that's also the human beings who are processing them. They become my witnesses. So for me, that's what I'm looking at. Bottom line, I'm looking at, can I get this in front of a judge? And if I can, and it's good evidence, will the jury understand it, number one? And will the jury, through the witness, buy it? So it's a bit different for me. The way cases begin, many times an agent will come in and say, Karyn, I have a really good idea. I'd like to investigate this based upon XYZ. I have an informant. Informants can be anyone. Many times in money laundering cases and otherwise, they happen to be ex-wives and spurned lovers of both sexes. And they make fantastic witnesses because they know where all the bodies are buried and they know exactly everything. And they are more than happy to come in and talk. So I will go through we do historical investigations, not reactive. We don't, not something happens and boom, we're indicting it. We do it historically. We are building that like a structure, if you will. So ultimately for me as a federal prosecutor, once I'm comfortable that I have all the information, this goes back to what Rashmi was talking about the data, pulling all that, going through, speaking to the financial expert, whoever that may be, And it makes sense to me. I understand it. And finally, most importantly, that it actually is a violation of law. And at that point, as a federal prosecutor, I have a number of routes, but traditionally, if I want, I can open a grand jury investigation. It's something we inherited from the British, not in many jurisdictions, but it's an excellent forum. It's essentially just citizens who have been called to sit, to listen to cases, to make a legal determination in the sense that, do the facts that have been presented, is there enough to indict here? Now, that's a very short 2-second law school kind of definition, but then the grand jury decides, they vote either to indict, not indict. Once they indict, we're off and running. And then as Mark had said, you're bringing in everything from the very beginning. And then I have to put it all before a court of law. But the last thing I want to talk about from the investigative point of view, it'd be interesting to see from Rashmi, Robin, or Mark, or Manesh, your perspective. I know in the US, we also at the federal system will have SAR review teams where we're looking at suspicious transactions, suspicious reports within the prosecutorial, with the law enforcement, et cetera. I can use those. When I say I'm talking on behalf of the prosecution team, which incorporates investigators, analysts, and myself as a prosecutor. I can use that SAR or STR, as people say, for information, but I can't put that piece of paper into trial in a federal court. Okay? So I've got to start there. It's a good lead, but again, that has to lead us to concrete evidence, whether that's the form of documentation, data, or a human being that I can put on a stand. So for me, bottom line, Manesh, I want to get those bad guys. And to get those bad guys, you got to take your time. You have to have skilled people. You have to work together, and then you got to put it all before a jury. So.
Yeah. So again, like Karyn, and to reiterate what Karyn was saying, it's different processes with UK-based processing that the investigator actually carries it all the way through and does Karyn's role as well, until it gets to an impartial charging decision. That is then charged. You still deal with all the case paper matters. So you're dealing with all that detail, all that minutiae, that granular material. And then the only process, apart from a little bit of advisory in terms of the legal context of the case, is the process of instructing counsel. Counsel, a barrister, will then act within court to persuade a jury that dependent on whether they go guilty or not guilty, usually not guilty, is that they will try and persuade a jury as an advocate. Okay, so a different system in that we take it all the way through. So I've had discussions with several of Karyn's colleagues in the past. The approach is different in the US to what it is, say, in the UK or some of those other Commonwealth-based countries. In terms of that investigation criteria, that material for me is, I couldn't use that as I couldn't use that as formal intelligence. Okay, so I couldn't put it into the court. I couldn't let the court anywhere near it. Okay, but what I can do is then review it and then go to a court with a court order, with a production order, go to the judge and say to the judge, I need this material for this purpose, signs it. I then go to the bank gives me the raw material, I do my investigation. That's the way that SARS works. This is not out of school talk. It's all over the internet. People want to go and do this within the legislation. And this is what I'm saying about details. This law, it's all this stuff at the back of me at the moment. It's detailed, it's composite, it allows governance, it allows things to be done right. When I was talking about legislation earlier on in yesterday's kind of comments, questions element, is that here in Singapore, so the firm that I'm currently running, Hill & Associates, is a licensed security service provider. Okay, so here we can act as a gateway for fintech RegTech products. Why are fintech RegTech products implemented within banks that then haven't been through those licensing processes? And when you get to a court at the other end, or you get the SPF knocking on your bank's door with a 2-year prison sentence, what's going to happen then? All about the detail, all about enterprise risk management.
Mark, I'd love to spend another hour with you here, but I'm being told we're almost out of time.
Sorry, guys.
And that
don't
always
leave
happens
us,
with
Manesh.
Mark, doesn't it? I thought maybe if we could just have a quick run through each of you and just kind of have you maybe spend 20 to 30 seconds, just final thoughts or key messages on case management investigations to leave our audience with some final thoughts. Let's start with Rashmi.
I agree with how Mark started off, and I actually think, as a financial crimes compliance officer, this is the sexiest part of the work that we do. It really is. It's a culmination of everything that we do across the program, right? The hundreds of millions of dollars or the billions of dollars that banks spend on KYC or screening or transaction monitoring processes. It all comes to this. You need to be able to effectively detect your financial crimes risk and report. If this part fails, nothing else matters. Sometimes it does tend to sort of fade away from the limelight, because the limelight is on, from a bank perspective, it's typically on KYC, because that cuts across all areas of the business, whereas with investigations, you have a bunch of people sitting in a back office somewhere and doing most of the grunt work. So they don't tend to be in the spotlight, but this is what matters. And having a very effective case management system, having analysts who are highly skilled at investigations, depending on the layer that they are working on, right? As I said, there's that investigations layer that requires expertise, and you have to make sure that you have invested in making in resourcing that function with people who are highly skilled, competent, and having a very robust feedback across these different areas of the program, having the ability to ingest leads that come from law enforcement from time to time. You can't have a rigid program. Your program should be able to assess different risks differently and fast track certain reviews. So when there's a lead from law enforcement, that will obviously have to be fast tracked through the process. So you need a program, a case management system that is sufficiently flexible to accommodate all this. And that's really critical to having a successful financial crimes compliance program in a bank.
Thank you, Rashmi. Robin?
Yeah, I want to reiterate the sexiness that my two previous panelists just highlighted. It is the most sexy part. I mean, Steve Jobs always said that you've got to start with the customer first and work backwards. And there isn't any other tool in the RegTech stack, in my humble opinion, that represents that better than case management. Our solutions end to end. It can be used from like smaller customers right through to bigger customers as well. But I think that what I said earlier about having that data lake, data platform is a really, really important element to that. I think that the other thing that I would also, sorry man, I got to plug this in here is have Karyn talk about the fintech partnership that she's put together. That's really, really interesting. Yeah,
Wow.
that's it from me.
That was smooth, Robin. Thank you. That was not planned.
I tried.
Nice.
Go ahead, Karyn.
Thank you. I just want to first start with my thanks. Thank you to everyone on the panel. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the United States Department of Justice to you and your audience members. We at the Department of Justice are committed to enforcing U.S. federal laws in a fair and transparent manner, and our ability to do so with respect to many crimes, but in addition to financial crime, really depends on the compliance officers, the people that work for them. What you do is important. What you do matters to us, and we look forward to beginning a closer community. Frequently, unfortunately, a lot of times, the first time you would see me in a federal court of law, it's not a good thing. Okay, we want to have meetings before then, where we're face-to-face as colleagues, sharing information. What Robin had spoken about was I've launched the U.S. Department of Justice FinTech Public-Private Partnership Dialogue, looking at AML and counterterrorism financing. This is not one of those financial intelligence partnerships, of which there are many, and they're doing a fantastic job. This is more of literally getting startups, CEOs, new people to the RegTech, FinTech, actually at the same table with U.S. government, with regulators, the reserve banks, myself. And what we're doing, Manesh, is we're learning from each other. And what we get to learn from the CEOs, these startups, whether they've just begun or they're more mature, what's happening, what's working, what's not. What do we learn from the U.S. government side? We have an opportunity to really get in at the very core and explain to them what our regulations are. I'm sure they're familiar, hopefully, but if not, why they're important, and to have that discussion and a respectful exchange of ideas so that we don't wind up in a U.S. federal court of law where they're saying, will the defendant please rise? That's a situation no one wants. So we're looking to kind of obviate that. And my thanks to Robin, who has been fantastic as a liaison, connecting us, the U.S. government, with people who are interested and have open minds. So thank you, Robin. That was beautiful. You could have been a trial attorney. That was so smooth. And thank you to my fellow panelists. And Manesh, fantastic job. Thank you.
Let's post some details on that on the event chat. But aside from that, thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rashmi, Robin, Karyn. We've overrun a bit. So yeah, just want to say thank you for joining this panel, and I'll speak to you again soon.